Thanks so much, Sheila, and it's really a pleasure to be here this evening. So I'm going to be talking about reptiles that lived during the Mesozoic time in Oregon. Many of you know that 200 million years ago, Oregon didn't even exist. The edge of the continent was in the western part of Idaho, so it was all oceanic. So I'm going to talk about how Oregon built up over time. So to help explain why we have more in the way of marine reptiles that lived during the Mesozoic time period, and only a couple examples of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, by definition, are animals that lived on the land. And so since it was oceanic for the most part, we have few remains of those. So here this is Oregon, and this map shows the distribution of the different Mesozoic rocks throughout the state. So in Southwest Oregon, we have Triassic to Cretaceous rocks in this area down here around Brookings and Cape Sebastian. The other principal area where we have Mesozoic rocks, and again, they're mainly Upper Triassic in age through Jurassic and then spots of marine Cretaceous overlapping all of those. Those are in the two different shades of green up here. And again, most of those are Upper Triassic through Middle Jurassic in age. The one area that we'll focus on also in this talk is the kind of middle-ish marine deposits of the Hudson Formation that are found around Mitchell, because that's where some reptiles have been found. So I'm going to do a little bit to characterize the Mesozoic time period. So this is kind of this is a geologic column showing the history of the Earth. The Earth began presumably about 4.5 billion years ago. And the Mesozoic goes from about 250 to about 65 million years, something like that. Through Precambrian time, through billions of years, the Earth was, there were some soft-bodied organisms around after a while, but shelly life wasn't really preserved or formed until the beginning of the Cambrian. So it took a long time for the oxygen levels to have built up in the ocean, in these Precambrian oceans, until the animals could sustain enough energy to grow shells, like you have in clams today and crabs and things like that. So beginning of the Cambrian, we have the advent of shelly life forms and abundant fossils. And so we have a really abundant fossil record going from the Cambrian on up to the present. In the Paleozoic, we had the age of the fishes and the amphibians, and of course, the Mesozoic, the age of the dinosaurs, and the age of the mammals beginning about 65 million years ago. Most of you probably know that there were 5 major mass extinction events that happened in the last 450 million years. 2 of those are in the Paleozoic. A third one was right at the Permo-Triassic boundary, and that was the maximal. That was the most dramatic extinction event that ever occurred. I studied lower Triassic invertebrate faunas in Idaho and Utah for a number of years, and the clam communities in these basal Jurassic beds remained small. The clams remained rather diminutive, and the communities had a rather simple structure, even as late as 7 or 8 or 10 million years after the end of the extinction event. So it was a dramatic extinction event where 95% of the species got wiped out, but there was a persistent pressure on the faunas for a long period of time. There's another extinction event right here at 200 million years, right at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. That's a time when ammonites almost became extinct. The nautiloids dropped off dramatically, and there was a faunal turnover in many other groups as well. I happen to be familiar with that time period because I worked for many years down in Nevada in a place called New York Canyon, where we have the Gads Formation, the overlying Sunrise Formation. We have a remarkably complete marine sequence through this system boundary, and I've been working several years. in evaluating, recording, and evaluating the life forms that did and didn't make it through that extinction event. And then finally, we have the one at the top of the Cretaceous, the one that killed off the dinosaurs. And that's one I think most of us are most familiar with. Again, I was a student at Berkeley when one of my professors, his name was Dr. Walter Alvarez. He was a new professor when I was a student there. He came from a think tank in Lamont Laboratories back east, and he and his father, so he was a geologist, he was a sedimentologist and a geologist, and he and his father made a trip to a place called Gubbio, Italy, and there they looked at marine rocks that spanned the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic. And they analyzed some of these rocks chemically, and they say, oh my goodness, there's one of these samples had an overabundance of an element called iridium. I said, well, iridium isn't supposed to occur in any abundance on the Earth. Where could it ever have come from? And they decided that it had to have been an extraterrestrial source. So they proposed a meteorite impact. You didn't know exactly where the meteorite hit the Earth. We later came to understand that it was down in the Yucatan Peninsula. But so here I was in the Earth Science building. The paleontologists are in the lower two floors, the geologists in the upper three floors. And here comes Walter coming in and announcing, and he did more work than just this examining the section at Gubbio. He found similar iridium concentrations at other places as well. But all us paleontologists were well trained to firmly understand that it took millions of years for the dinosaurs to gradually die out. We were all gradualists. And Walter came in and he said, no, this happened overnight. The dinosaurs, a big rock hit the Earth and it was all over for the dinosaurs. And so that set up a controversy that in one form or another may persist to this day. And it turns out, however, that there's a massive volcanic eruptions associated with every one of these extinction events, including the one at the end of the Cretaceous. Just to make a long story short, there was a bolide or a meteorite impact that hit the Yucatan Peninsula. And this rock that slammed into the Earth probably vaporized the ocean column in its path, hit the bottom of the ocean, sent dirt and dust and everything, and shrouding the Earth, causing a nuclear or a winter, cooling everything off and killing off a lot of the plant and animal life. But I think it just fortuitously, at the same time, that there was massive volcanic eruptions at the same time that pumped gases into the atmosphere and caused a chemically toxic environment for the dinosaurs as well as many of the other organisms that had lived at that time. So they got a double whammy. I think Walter was right, as well as the volcanologists, So, and I'll also say that while the dinosaurs did die out suddenly, there may have been some gradualistic die-off as well. I know at the end of the Triassic, for example, in that extinction event, I've examined the faunas carefully in those, and I have a sense that there's been some stress in some of these faunas that had persisted for about 3 million years before there was the final abrupt extinction event right at the end of the Triassic. So everybody's a little bit wrong, everybody's a little bit right in this story. So again, in Oregon, what we have, the Mesozoic record we have is Upper Triassic going all the way through well up into the Middle Jurassic. So that's the package of rocks, sedimentary rocks that we see in many cases in the Blue Mountains and the Wallowas. And then there's a big hiatus and then maybe spots here and there of Middle-ish Cretaceous to Upper Cretaceous rocks in Eastern Oregon, the West Coast. And so that's what we're going to take a look at. So again, why we don't have dinosaurs well represented in Oregon is probably because, as I mentioned, Oregon didn't exist 200 million years ago. There's a good reason for that. They didn't walk on water, you know. And so here's a diagram showing repositioning the continents through time. At the end of the Permian, we had all the continents assembled into a supercontinent called Pangea. And then starting about 190 million years ago, we had the Atlantic Ocean starting to form. And that rifting then resulted in massive outpourings of lava that we call the camp volcanics. And they're preserved in parts of South America, Northwestern Africa, Southeastern United States, and part of Western Europe. And it was those massive outpourings of lava at a very specific period of time that probably resulted in the extinction at the end of the Triassic. But as the Atlantic Ocean then was beginning to form through time, there was this mid-oceanic ridge where the magmas were coming up, and as new oceanic crust was forming, the result is that this oceanic crust that was forming wasn't subducting under the leading edge of Eastern North America or under Europe. The leading edges of those oceanic plates just kind of attached to the edge of the continent and started pushing North America to the west. So it just started pushing the North American continent over a period of time, so that the Pacific was absolutely huge. It was 17,000 miles across at the time. And then finally now, in the present stage, the Atlantic is about 5,000 miles across, and the Pacific is a mere 12,000 miles wide, something like that. But as these continents were, as North America was moving to the north, I'm oversimplifying this dramatically, but the oceanic plates were kind of moving west of North America, were moving to the north and to the east a little bit. And as they were doing that, there were lots of volcanic island chains, archipelagos and andesitic volcanic chains, kind of like what you see in Indonesia and Japan today. It was kind of a geographically messy area. And as North America moved to the west, it kind of swept up some of these island arcs that were offshore of Oregon. And it also, as the continental plates were, as the oceanic plate was moving to the north, is picking up slivers of microcontinental material off of South America and Central America, shoving it to the north, and these little pieces of microcontinent eventually got glued onto the leading edge of North America. And we first started getting a good idea of this when people who were working with paleomagnetism in rocks, for example, in Oregon or other places, they'd record it. They get the magnetic signature of a rock, say up from Canada or whatever, and they'd find that the magnetic minerals and everything were aligned kind of semi-parallel to the bedding of the rock. And they figured, well, the only place you get that is more in equatorial regions. So people working with paleomagnetism came up with the idea that lots of these pieces of microcontinent work their way to the north over time. So us paleontologists picked up on that, and I and a few other people published a paper in 1984. I won't get to that yet. So in Eastern Oregon, what we have are three of these little pieces of microcontinents or terrains. One's the Baker terrain, and I won't get into the details of this is simply a melange. But there's the Wallowa terrain to the north and the IZ sequence to the south. And both of these are what we would call tectonostratigraphic terrains. And each terrain has a sequence of rocks showing its own independent history. So it's a block of rock that formed somewhere else, got moved around, and then got glued onto the leading edge of the continent eventually. So us paleontologists got together and tried to kind of add to that story a little bit using the fossils that we're so fond of. And one of these things are called ammonites. That's something that I study a lot. I work with Triassic and Jurassic ammonites, and this is an ammonite from the, it was called the Supli area in the Ochoco Mountains. So ammonites evolved quickly, and they're also kind of indicative of paleolatitude to a degree. There's another, we worked at bivalves to some extent, clams, and this one happens to be from Nevada because it was one that was better preserved than some others that I have, but they're in Oregon as well. And they're all restricted to the lower part of the Jurassic. And I had students out with me one year, and I mean, this animal first appeared like 195 million years ago and then died out about 175 million years ago. But they decided, the kids that I took out in the field with me decided to print up a t-shirt called Save the Whale Up. So they were early environmentalists, I guess. So, but this whale is a pecten-like clam that's restricted all to the pretty much to the Eastern Pacific seaboard. So some of these animals give us an indication that these terrains weren't floating all over in the Pacific Ocean, that they were pretty much restricted to the Eastern Pacific margin. Now, this is a crinoid, and this had nothing to do, this specimen came from mist. It's only 36 million years old, but we don't have any complete specimens of crinoids from the Mesozoic, from Eastern Oregon. But I wanted to emphasize that that crinoids were very abundant in Eastern Oregon, and they actually make up many of the shallow water limestones, the little ossicles, the skeletal elements from these things. And so we can almost, some of them call them crinoidal limestones. They were so common. But the crinoid, they call them sea lilies. They look like flowers. They were prolific in Paleozoic seas and widespread in shallow water seas globally in the Paleozoic, very common in the Mesozoic, and then finally, where we became restricted to deep waters and in the last 60 million years. And so for the most part, they're around, but we don't see them very often. But they were a dominant element in the Mesozoic marine faunas. Another animal that was very common were belemnites. And they have, these belemnites look just like squids, except they have an internal shell, a skeleton or a shell. And we call these things belemnite guards. And when the Europeans first started finding these a long time ago, they'd find these all over the ground, and they thought, well, they look like old battlefields, so they call them belemnite battlefields. So a very common squid-like animal. There was one, in Northwestern Europe, things are so much better preserved sometimes than they are in these cruddly sediments in Oregon. I remember reading a paper by, I think the author was Young, published about 1830, and he went and he described where he found like a squid or a belemnite-like animal in these clay stones in England, and he saw the ink sac. He saw the outline of the animal, and he actually found the ink sac, and he took this ink sac from an animal that's 180 million years old, put this dried ink in a jar, swirled around, and then proceeded to write with it. So it's just remarkable ink that had been preserved for so many millions of years. Okay, so I said, so I and some other ammonite workers got together, and these are preliminary diagrams. We looked at the distribution of ammonites over time in the Jurassic time period. And we compared the ammonites with the ammonite distribution in Europe, which was much more stable at the time. Things weren't moving around so much. And we found in the Mediterranean area, there were ammonites that from the area of the old Tethyan Sea, they were low latitude ammonites and they represented kind of southern climes. To the north, in the brown, in northern Europe, we have boreal ammonites that lived at the higher latitudes. And then the blues represent an admixture of both the Tethyan and the boreal ammonites. And so we have diagrams from the kind of the lower, the middle, and the upper middle Jurassic. This is probably the best diagram that we have here. And on the continent, we have boreal ammonites on the continent that are going clear down to the southern part of into British Columbia and Alberta. In contrast, what we have in this one place called Quinalia, and then Steichenia, and then Rangelia to the west, we found that lower latitudinal assemblages containing low latitude ammonites were being shoved to the north relative to the boreal thing. And so that was an independent line of evidence using the ammonites that these terrains, in fact, have been shoved 1,500 or 2,000 kilometers north of where they were formed in late Triassic and early Jurassic time. And then we go on up to the middle Jurassic. It shows less equivocal evidence of a major shifting. And then we get up into the upper part, middle to upper Jurassic, and what's interesting is we have just a dramatic boreal spread of faunas during progressively cooler climates as the boreal ammonites and other organisms spread further south. So the upshot of this is that the ammonites and the bivalves, to some extent, kind of corroborated what the paleomag people were coming up with. We have major shifting of these terrains over time, and we have tropical-like faunas that lived in the early Jurassic, probably lived around Mexico or Central America, and they ended up in the peninsular terrain up in Alaska eventually. And the other thing that we saw is that most of the ammonites indicate that these terrains actually were tied to the western edge of North America, and at least this invertebrate evidence indicates that the terrains weren't drifting across the Pacific all that much. Other animals may indicate a different story, but that's just what the ammonites show at any rate. And then finally, oh yeah, so this thing here called J and well, we'll call it the John Day terrain. So the eastern half of Oregon, I would say by the middle Jurassic time was starting to become continental at that time. It doesn't show, most of the old terrains are buried by more recent volcanics, so we just don't have a record of them. But I'd say the eastern third to eastern half of Oregon was pretty much built up by middle Jurassic time. And finally, at the last stage, and this post-dates what we're talking about, and you probably heard Ray Wells talk about this story. There was a hot spot offshore of Oregon, just like there's a hot spot under the Hawaiian Islands. Today, there was a hot spot offshore where there were massive outpourings of basaltic lavas and forming islands like the Hawaiian Islands, just offshore of Oregon. But remember, Oregon in North America was being pushed around by the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean was still pushing North America to the west. These hotspots presumably are stationary. So 55 million years ago, while the Steichenia, the Hawaiian-like islands, were just offshore of Oregon, and another 5 million years in the middle diagram, they got glued onto the western edge of North America. And when that happened 50 million years ago, Oregon took on pretty much the proportions and the shapes that you see today. And then as a continuation, final continuation to that story, as North America has progressed to the west over time, over this stable hotspot, we find that the hotspot is now where Yellowstone is today. So, and I remember Paul Hammond was kicking this idea, and you were too, many, many decades ago, you know, so. Okay, so here we are in the Nicely Formation in IZ area in Oregon. Oh yeah, on that map, I forgot to point out some of the geographic areas. But this is what a good sequence of exposures looks like of mudstones. These are upper lower Jurassic mudstone of a unit called the Nicely Formation. There's some ichthyosaur bones in this formation. There's a project that I worked on with a student from Geneva, Switzerland. There's a lab back there that provides some of the finest age dates that you can get anywhere. And so in Europe, in these equivalent age rocks, there's really nice ammonite sequences, but we don't have any asphalt beds that we can use to radiometrically date the rocks in Europe. So we have a relative time scale in Europe, but no radiometric scale. In the West Coast here, there were volcanoes all over the place, and they were spewing out ashes all the time. And so what they did in this lab, in this radiometric lab in Geneva, it's one of the finest labs in the world. You know, usually if you get a rock sample and date it, they'll date it 200 million years plus or minus what, several 100,000 years or whatever. So you've got a big spread of time. In this lab, so what we were doing in this mudstone unit, we were looking for ash beds, pick out an ash bed. The PhD student would pick out 20 zircon crystals, and he'd date each one individually, radiometrically. So if there was a zircon that was Precambrian age, you just threw it out. You throw out the outliers. But the lab was so precise, they could get a date of 200 million years plus or minus a few tens of thousands of years. So in the sequence, he was able to get 8 successive dates in a row, and we have a radiometrically fantastically defined sequence in this interval of time. So anyway, it was a fun project to work on. If you want to, in Oregon, the rocks are covered with a lot of sagebrush, but if you really want to look at really well-exposed rocks, you go down to Nevada where the rocks are better exposed. So, and this is the hillside where we have the record of the Triassic going right up to this point right here. Triassic fauna stopping, a barren interval of about 5 meters, and then the Jurassic fauna starting there. So when I'm studying the Jurassic and the Triassic, I'm relying a lot on sequences in Nevada as well. This is what the typical terrain looks like in the Supli area in the western part of the Ochagos and the Blue Mountains. And so I spent some of my earlier years going up and down these draws here and measuring what we call stratigraphic sections and working up what I call the stratigraphy of the snowshoe formation in that area. This is what the area looks. It's not remarkably well exposed like it is in Nevada. So I'll have to get a pick and a shovel and dig trenches across the hillside in order to record the layers very well. Oh, slide that didn't work. The blank slide was an ammonite in a crinoidal limestone, a shallow water limestone. This slide is a mudstone, an offshore mudstone, where you don't have shallow water faunas, but you have ammonites. Okay. And it's so far offshore, you don't even find ichthyosaur bones out there for some strange reason. So in my younger years, I went all over the western part of the United States and I'm measuring sections everywhere. And I came up with this scheme, whether it's this nearshore offshore scheme of where different groups of invertebrate animals were relatively abundant. For example, in the bottom down here, you have the crinoids that are prolific in the shelf, and then they drop off offshore. The ammonites probably weren't really fantastic swimmers, so they didn't do well in the very inshore deposits, but then they were more prolific in the outer part of the shelf and off into the basin in waters that were probably several hundred meters deep. So I came up with this nearshore offshore scheme that seems to work for me repeatedly. And I'll just, we don't have enough vertebrate evidence yet, but I would think that you could do, if we found enough vertebrate material, we could probably come up with a similar scheme for nearshore, offshore distribution of vertebrates. The plesiosaurs in the inshore part, the marine crocodiles that we find came from the inshore part right in here. And then, whereas the ichthyosaurs start about here, go offshore to a few hundred meters of water, but for the most part, you go off into the really deep waters and you don't find any vertebrates way off in the middle of the basin either. So some of the marine reptiles that we actually see. There was a great car, I think, with a Nard group. He came across north of Suplee a big rock in the hillside, and it was an upper Triassic block of limestone that was just prolific. It was just loaded with these bones of this marine reptile. There are a lot of different kinds of marine reptiles in the Triassic rocks. They're not well represented in Oregon, but Greg found the first thalattosaur from there. And he's been working painstakingly over the years and doing a wonderful job of preparing all of these things. And I'm sure they're getting ready to describe this animal now formally. So thalattosaurs, it's a group found in the western part of the Suplee area and now well represented thanks to Mr. Carr. The ichthyosaurs were the most widespread group. That's me many years ago. I had a beard then and dark hair and more hair. And this is down in Berlin. Ichthyosaur used to be a state park. I think it's a monument now, but there's a place in a upper Triassic formation. It was called the Looning Formation, where there were a few dozen skeletons of these huge ichthyosaurs. They were probably animals that got stranded, but just a mass of skeletons from this place. And this thing's called Shoniosaurus. And it's an animal that we haven't found yet in Oregon, but I wouldn't be surprised if we find one soon. So ichthyosaurs first appear in the early part of the Triassic, but in upper Triassic rocks, we do find remains of them in Oregon. And and it was, so this is what they looked like. The more primitive ones of these ichthyosaurs evidently had a relatively small dorsal fin. It was Dr. William Orr who, along with Kirk Katsura, had worked up, somebody found some vertebrae up in the Wallowa Mountains and the Martin Bridge Formation, late Triassic Norian unit. And he had a string of vertebrae, about 23 vertebrae and a whole bunch of ribs, and he was able to relate these to a thing called Shastasaurus. So Bill Orr and Katsura described the earliest ichthyosaur anywhere from Oregon. It came from the Wallowa Mountains. And I'll just add again, just to emphasize that they haven't been reported or described or anything, but there are remnants of ichthyosaur bones from upper Triassic and other places in Oregon as well. But it's a really well-preserved specimen that Dr. Orr described. Here's another, and that was Shastasaurus. This is a Shastasaurus from China. And I just include this one as really interesting because these long stringy things down here are actually crinoids. So, so this is a deposit in the southwestern part of China. The animal died and was laid down in this kind of black shale deposit. And the hypothesis is that these crinoids, these echinoderms that look like they're called seal lilies, actually were attached to logs that were floating across the area and then fell off the logs and then it landed on the bottom of the ocean. When you get up into the lower and the middle Jurassic, nothing's been really described yet, but there are pieces of ichthyosaurs that are widespread throughout the Blue Mountains. You find them in various localities in the Blue Mountains. And the ichthyosaurs are going to look just like those that you find in Europe. This is a reconstruction of an ichthyosaur from Great Britain or Germany or Great Britain. This more advanced ichthyosaur had a larger dorsal fin, and they had long, slender beak with sharp conical teeth, so that they were probably really feeders of fish, as well as ammonites and mollusks and other types of organisms. Remember, these ichthyosaurs died out at the end of the Paleozoic, or at the end of the Mesozoic period. And they were replaced in a way by the whales. So whereas the whales have a fluke, the tail goes down to a little point, the vertebral column, the flukes, the tail fin on the whale is horizontally. So when the whale moves through the water, it moves by flipping his tail up and down. The ichthyosaurs were totally different. They decided to do something different. Yeah, and the vertebral column bent down and the flukes were vertical. So they went side to side as they moved through the water. But ichthyosaurs and whales were both very efficient swimmers. And they had really great eyesight too. This is another one from Europe. Probably not unlike something that we might find in the Jurassic here as well. Here's an outline of one from Germany. And you can see where the vertebral column is bent down like that, and that where it's bent down, that supports the lower tail fin right there. Here's a skulled one from Europe again. And they had really huge eyes. The eye was only in this inner part, but they had a huge thing, a bony ring around here called a sclerotic ring. So a really absolutely huge eye socket. Again, a long beak with sharp conical teeth. So they were well represented and scattered in many deposits in Eastern Oregon. And so again, here we are in the Suplee and IZ area here. It's the Suplee area where we have found some vertebra as well as the IZ from the it's in Suplee where we found the thalattosaur from the upper Triassic. And we also have vertebra from the lower and the middle Jurassic of ichthyosaurs here. The ichthyosaur from up around the Wallowa Mountains that Bill had described up there. And in the upper Jurassic down here near Brookings, I think, is where somebody had found an upper Triassic ichthyosaur as well. So ichthyosaurs, definitely the most common marine reptile in Oregon. So one other spot that I want to emphasize too is this Cretaceous marine incursion around Mitchell. And that's where a group from the North American Research Group, the NARG group, I think, they found the jawbone, a 2-foot-long jawbone to a plesiosaur, a short-necked plesiosaur. Plesiosaurs are fairly common, but that's the first record of a plesiosaur from Oregon. And I I think it's at the South Dakota School of Mines. A person by the name of Jim Martin is working with it, and presumably will publish that at some point in time. But we do, so one record of a plesiosaur. And then in 1928, there was a record of a flying reptile from the same area around Mitchell, where they found the upper arm bone or a humerus and a couple of vertebrae to a large flying reptile. And the name of it is something like called Benetacea. This is not Benetacea right here. This is called Quetzalcoatlus. There was a fellow student of mine who, when I was a student at Berkeley, a fellow student had found this large humerus of a pterodactyl, and he hypothesized it, and he found it from the uppermost Cretaceous rocks in Texas, and figured that pterodactyl was probably had a wingspan of nearly 50 feet. So really large animal. I'm glad they're not around today. So, and actually, I'm glad the dinosaurs died out too. We wouldn't have been here today if the dinosaurs didn't die out. The dinosaurs lived for like 160 million years, and the mammals were around for almost the same length of time. But they remained small. They looked around, they saw these big dinosaurs, and for some reason that escapes all of us, we can't understand even to this day, why didn't you get large mammals that competed with the dinosaurs? It just didn't happen. As the dinosaurs got a foothold first, and it remained that way until the end of the Cretaceous, and the dinosaurs died out. And then the 2 to 3 or 4 genera of small mammals, they looked around, after the end of the Cretaceous, says, oh, they're gone. We can do anything that we want. And the first 10 million years of the Cenozoic period, we had all the 40 or whatever, the large numbers of marine, not marine, I'm talking of mammals, the orders of mammals, the modern orders of mammals developed in a very short period of time. So we had the whales, odd-toed hoofed animals, the even-toed hoofed animals, the primates, all these, the rodents, the rabbits, they all developed in a short period of time over just a handful of a million years. And then the last 50 million years or so of the Cenozoic has just been filling in the details pretty much, So the primates probably wouldn't have ever developed, and we wouldn't be here if it weren't for the demise of the dinosaurs. So I am happy that they died out.
You didn't watch the face cells.
Pardon? No, I didn't. No, I didn't. Yeah, okay. I'll rewatch it and see what I got wrong. So, okay, so there's another marine reptile. Again, that we found, it has been found in the Supli area, and that was named after the North American Research Group, not this particular one, but the crocodile that was found out in that area. But there was a group of crocodiles that in the upper part of the lower Jurassic, they started transforming into a marine form. And so we have a marine crocodile group called the Metriorhynchus that are found in the middle Jurassic and the upper Jurassic, and then they died out after that. But what's interesting about this, here's the vertebral column. This is a European specimen, but you see the vertebral columns, they have the flexure. They bend down just like an ichthyosaurus. So they had this vertical tail again. They swish back and forth, just kind of like a ichthyosaur would. Some of the earlier Metriorhynchids, I think it probably could walk on land. But as they developed, they had paddles for feet and they swam around fairly efficiently in shallow waters. So we have a record of those from the Middle Jurassic as well. Just in one area, not widespread in Oregon, but just in one area in one period of time. And they had this big orbit. So they had sideways, a lot of crocodiles have eyes that kind of look more up into the air. These meteororhynchids, they had laterally disposed eyes, and then sharp conical rows of teeth in here. And this is what they look like. And so well developed for swimming in shallow water oceans. And you see where the downturn tail is and the vertically disposed limbs so that it can swish through the water kind of like a ichthyosaur could.
How large were those?
Pardon?
How large?
Um, I'd say 10 to 15, 16 feet or so, something like that, for the most part. Give or take a few. So they didn't get to be huge. Some of the ichthyosaurs got to be really large. They had a large size range, but these 10 to 15 feet is a kind of good average size range for those things. Now we get to the dinosaurs. So I guess it was 2015, Professor Ritali had been working out again in this Husbeth Formation, this Middle-ish Middle-ish Cretaceous marine rocks around Mitchell, and he was digging the rocks. The newspaper article said, sitting on the top of a pile of ammonites, he found a toe bone. So I found that, and so I had separately had been working on a dinosaur that somebody had found a long time ago. And so I was back in the American Museum of Natural History in 2016 or 2017, and photographed all the duck-billed dinosaur bones that I could find because I was working on a sacrum. And so this is a foot that I had photographed. And so the toe bone that Greg found evidently was from a herbivorous bipedal dinosaur. That's all that we can tell. And it was probably one of these short, stubby little bones that look something like that. And so anyway, so Dr. Ritalik had a record of a hadrosaur. No, it wasn't a hadrosaur, just a bipedal plant-eating dinosaur from the Middle-ish Cretaceous from the Mitchell area. So a dinosaur. So I'm kind of jumping around here a little bit. And he published that, I think, in 2018. So separately, back in 1961, I believe, it was two geologists, and to this day, we don't know who they were. They were with the U.S. Geological Survey. They're mapping in the area, and they were walking across the sea cliffs at Cape Sebastian. They found these bones in the sea cliffs there. And so nothing was done with those things for a while. There was a group from Berkeley, J. Wyatt Durham and Don Savage and a few other people. They made a trip up there in 1969 and they saw it. And I don't know if I have that doesn't show up. Oh, that's the one that doesn't show up. Okay, doesn't make any difference. Don Savage made a sketch of that sacrum, and he figured it was a dinosaur. And next to that, I had a photograph, and you could show that. So we had Don Savage's sketch as it appeared in 1969, and I made a photograph comparing that with the way it looked in 1994. But in the mid 1990s, there was a guy uh, uh, from University of Oregon that says, Dave, I was the only one around that was collecting vertebrate fossils at the time. It says somebody has to dig up that dinosaur sacrum at Cape Sebastian, or the whole thing's going to wash away, and our only record of a dinosaur is going to disappear forever, So I reluctantly agreed to do that. I led a field trip up there. I wasn't going to do this all by myself because people were saying, well, this bone is from a titanium hard sandstone. So everybody, I think, was afraid to dig it out. So I got a whole bunch of people with me. We had a lot of fun down there. There were about 20 of us. And we spent a long weekend and we got it out in a weekend, you know. So, um, but everything's a little bit out of sequence right now. Oh, yeah. Okay. And so here it is. That's me a long time ago when I had more hair than I do right now. But we're excavating the sacrum to this duck-billed dinosaur from the sandstones. And I might mention that this thing, although it hadn't been formally described, it had already been published. So there was a, for example, the person who wrote a book with a whole bunch of authors. They called this big book the Dinosauria, and and they recognized people had looked at it. This guy Leahy and other people had sent photographs around. Everybody knew that this was obviously a dinosaur, and they knew that it was probably a duck-billed dinosaur. And so in 1990, they recorded that there was a probable duck-billed dinosaur for Cape Sebastian, even though it hadn't been it hadn't been dug out yet. They had another edition of it. They recorded it again, and in 2004, they recorded it again. And then Bill Orr, in his publication on fossils of Oregon, recorded the duck-billed dinosaur. And it also was published in National Geographic magazine. So we had all these occurrences of this thing, but it was still in the rock. So in 1994, we got it out. And here we are all chipping away at it. The front end of the sacrum is to the left, the right, the back end is to the right. And we'd already taken out some other parts of the sacrum. We would remove part of it already. This was just the front major part of it. Even from this photograph, you can tell that it's the dinosaur. It's a land-dwelling animal because you look at the main body of the vertebra, the center are down here. Oh, I'm going to do take a little side trip. The neural arch, this is kind of skimmed off at the top a little bit, and you can see that the right half of the sacrum is gone, and so this is kind of like a cross section looking right through the middle of where the neural canal runs down through the animal. And so the neural canal is kind of narrow in the front end, and then it winds out and becomes quite enlarged. The neural canal, like the spinal cord we have in our back in the hip region, it flared out dramatically in the hip region. Well, some paleontologists who worked a long time ago saw this in a few other dinosaurs, and they knew that dinosaurs were big, stupid things with bird brains, and so they probably had to have two brains in order to function. One walnut-sized brain in the head, you know, and then in an enlargement, they figured, well, there was another brain there so that the animal could move his tail back and forth or whatever, you know. It's obviously wrong, but it was a reasonable idea to come up with at the time. You know, we all come up with silly ideas, you know, and J. Wyatt Durham at Berkeley was one of my advisors, and he said, you know, it's as if half of what you publish comes out to be correct, you've done really well. You know? So, but at any rate, it was clear that this was, even from working it out of the rock and the photographs that we saw, these vertical supports right here are called sacral ribs. And you only find the style of sacral ribbing in a land-dwelling animal that needed a lot of support for its sacrum. So it was blatantly obvious that it was a dinosaur. There's a good friend of mine, Ken Thiessen, who took this specimen. Oh yeah, here, I'll keep going. Here's, there were three more vertebrae, sacral ribs attached to the end, but this is a small portion of it. Came from the back end of the animal here. It didn't come from the crested dinosaur, duck-billed dinosaur like this. It came from a non-crested dinosaur. And just as a sidelight, when I was at the American Museum of Natural History, let's see if that, oh yeah, here's a close-up of it. here's some tailbones to a duck-billed dinosaur. So does anybody see these spotty little things here? Does anybody have any idea what that is? These granular little things on the tail vertebra? Pardon? Yeah, kind of like that. It's skin. So the duck-billed dinosaurs were studded with little bony little studs all over their skin. And so when the animal died and desiccated, the skin got impressed onto the tail vertebra. So we have several examples of skins that being preserved in the duck-billed dinosaurs. So it was a fun thing to see. So this is the kind of dinosaur that it came from, the sacrum that we found, a non-crested duck-billed dinosaur. And this is what the main part of it, there's more to it. The whole thing is like 2.5 feet long altogether. It's a pretty sizable thing. Here's the enlargement showing where the brain obviously was. And that's the inside with the neural canal. And there's the left side with the anterior end there and the posterior end there. And so, yeah, Ken Thiessen, a friend of mine, the fall after we excavated this thing, took it up to a Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meeting up in Seattle, Washington, and showed it to people up there. And there's one guy up there who was, oh God, his name escapes me right now. The guy that was the duck-billed dinosaur expert. He was from Montana. He knew more about duck-billed dinosaurs than anybody else. And he looked at this specimen and he said, yeah, it's obviously dinosaur. It's either to a theropod or a meat-eating dinosaur, or it's a duckbill. What he didn't know from this one specimen that he saw is that we had 3 more vertebrae to it. And it's obvious that it would have been a duckbill because duckbills are the only animal that has 8 or more vertebrae. And it turns out that this had 9 vertebrae. So, so anyway, this thing had been published on, what, 6 times already. And so evidently, and it turns out that I published, and my publication on this thing came out in 2018. It got published about a month after Greg Ritelli published on his toe bone, which was really interesting. I had no clue as to what that he was putting out a paper in this, but so just by chance, these 2 papers happened to come out just at about the same time. And Greg's came out a month earlier. But in that paper, he wrote very definitively, that he had his toe bone was the first dinosaur from Oregon. And he's very clear about that. And that there was a bone found in the Southwest Oregon to something, but obviously it couldn't have been identified. It could have been a turtle or a plesiosaur. So the largest turtle that I know about is a turtle called Archelon. It lived in the Upper Cretaceous and it had a total length of about 12 feet. Well, the sacrum that we have is 2.5 feet long. So I'm not going to go into details as to why it's not a turtle, but it's obvious, And it's the same thing with something like a plesiosaur right here. Here's the sacral region. They didn't have fused vertebra and they didn't have anything that looked anything like a land-dwelling dinosaur. So it was, so I have no understanding of why one person determined that thing from the Southwest Oregon coast wasn't a dinosaur when it had already been published in about 6 different places. So finally, that's the end of the talk now.
What was the length of that?
Of this thing right here? I don't know exactly, probably about 12 or 15 feet, something like that.
Fairly.
Yeah, fairly large. And those from the Lower and middle Jurassic that I've seen are all in about that size range. Some of those, oh, I've got to get over here. Some of those from the upper Triassic got to be really large, you know, like 50 feet long or so. But those from the lower and middle Jurassic, for the most part, were probably in the 10 to 15 foot range.
The plesiosaur would have been longer.
The plesiosaurs, there were some smaller ones, but bigger varieties as well. Yes.
Did you explain why there was a duck-billed platypus or dinosaur on the coast of Oregon?
Oh, yeah. Well, that might have been.
One of the dinosaurs.
Oh, here's the sequence right here. Yeah, there was, yeah, the picture I was looking for, it threw me off when when I was missing a couple of pictures. This is the sequence from Cape Sebastian, the rock sequence, the lower conglomeratic part. You can say, can you see the scale here, 50 meters there? Okay, so the dinosaur came from this level here in a sandstone sequence, and they call them hummocky beds right here. They're storm-generated beds. And so I don't want to get into the details about what a hummocky bed is, but it's from a very shallow water deposit. Probably these sands were laid down in a few tens of meters of water, well within the agitated wave base of swells moving back and forth. And so there was a shoreline not too far away. And it was a sacrum that probably just got washed out in the storm-generated event from a nearby landmass. I will add, I wasn't going to mention this earlier. Remember, this is a transported tectonic terrain. So this could easily have come from some other location when the animal was living. Could have come from Mexico or California or something like that, you know? So maybe the terrain here, this piece of land, was adjacent to a landmass in California or Mexico or whatever. And then transported to the north and finally got glued into the Brookings area where it is today. So maybe it isn't an Oregon dinosaur at all. Maybe it's the first California. Maybe it's the first California immigrant into Oregon. You know, we're still trying to figure that one out, you know, so. Pardon?
That would make Greg right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, right. There's no doubt about it. So, but again, just to summarize, you know, we have scattered throughout Oregon. There was another professor that was a generation above me. His name was William Dickinson, and I don't know if he told me this or I think I read it in a publication. He said, oh yeah, there's vertebrate detritus out there. So he didn't think as much as about how valuable vertebrates were compared to maybe some of us that are spending all our time looking for these things, you know. But there is a fair amount of vertebrate detritus out in the upper Triassic through middle Jurassic and Cretaceous rocks. And with further investigations, I think especially in some of the Cretaceous marine inliers, we're bound to find more as time goes on. Okay, so that's my talk.
We're going to take questions now from, let's take a few, we'll alternate questions from the online audience and then the in-person audience.
Okay.
So far, we only have one question on Zoom here from Carrie Gordon. She's wondering what the duck-billed dinosaur, did it float in or actually walked on land here?
Repeat the question.
You mean the one from the south?
Repeat?
Oh, yeah. The duck-billed dinosaur, did it float in or did it walk on land? I can tell you unequivocally, we can't tell you whether it floated in. That's one certainty. We can't tell you that for certain. But, for example, in Cape Sebastian, if this thing came from a landmass adjacent to some area in California, it could have washed in from a landmass. Remember, the sacrum that we found was from a storm, founded in a storm-generated bed. So there were heavy currents and probably a really strong current that washed that sacrum from land out to sea.
So
That's just guesswork.
Accreted terrain also.
Pardon?
It was an accreted terrain.
That was, yes, that was absolutely, it was an accreted terrain. Yeah. Yes.
If the meteor atomized the oceans, and I guess at the beginning of our period,
Oh yeah, at the end of the Cretaceous, at the end of.
then are there remains from that meteor explosion on the bottom of the ocean everywhere on Earth that you could find and corroborate the iridium and things like that that came from the meteorite that it did?
Yeah, the one at the end of the Cretaceous, I mean, this is years ago, the last time I looked at it, and there were like 80 different locations spread across the world where they found iridium enriched beds in various places. And I don't, follow this close. Pardon?
At the bottom of the ocean?
There was at the bottom of the ocean at one time. Yeah, iridium that was formed either at the bottom of the ocean or some other, probably mainly from marine rocks, probably from some continental ones as well, however. And there's little tektites and glass shards. There's evidence, from other locations that there was this big splash down the Yucatan Peninsula. And again, I'm not intimately familiar with this, but there's some people that were working, I think, more in the western interior of the United States, where they found some places where it looked like a die-off as animals that were killed off as a result of that meteorite impact. So yeah, we have lots of evidence for that in many places all over the world.
Okay, I got another one. Are there any fossil finds in Oregon, even plant or invertebrate, that are still somewhat confounded? Or is it everything relatively familiar to other flora and fauna in the fossil record?
Yeah, and I mean, we're coming up with new things all the time, and I'm describing, I work with ammonites, right? So I'm working with new faunas, and I have to understand the relationship of a new genus I have with something that's been discovered before. So every time I go out, I find something new all the time. I'm finding, this summer I went out and I found a kind of a bivalve that elsewhere had only been found in South America before. And so it extends the range of this genus of clam up to North America. So there are new things that we are finding all the time. We know there's much more that we don't know than there is that we do know. So things aren't all settled yet. Yes.
Did you say it was a mystery why there were no large mammals while the dinosaurs existed? And repeat the question.
Oh yeah, you said, yeah, as far as I know, and I don't study this closely, yeah, I think it's still a mystery as to why there weren't a lot of large mammals living at the same time that the dinosaurs did.
Mammals developed after the dinosaurs were already large, so the mammals started small and they had to hide. And so anytime, if they were going to become big, they have to go through a medium size. And the medium size would have been too big to hide and too small to defend oneself.
Yeah, but look, there were little and medium-sized dinosaurs running around too. So, there weren't just big dinosaurs, there are dinosaurs of all sizes. It's just a fundamental mystery to me is why, a few mammals say, hey, let's try something different, and it never worked, so. I have some ideas with regulatory mechanism, but with genetic regulatory mechanism, but we're not going to get into that, so.
Then they went hog wild during the ice
Then,
ages.
Yeah, they went, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, did the toe bone wash in from distant land, or was it found in an treated land sediment?
Like, no, I don't think that wasn't a created land at that time. The toe bone wasn't. So what was the first part of the question?
Yeah, did the toe bone wash in from distant land, or was it found in an treated land sediment?
Yeah, I don't know how distant the land was that the toe bone was washed in. There could have been, I just don't know that. Yeah, we don't know the geography well enough. Mm-hmm.
So there was a chart that showed Rangalia and Stakinia
Yeah.
that had the ammonite fossils. And then there was a piece of land in Oregon and some piece in California that also had ammonite fossils. So do you mean to say they were all connected ones and they got separated out, or?
They weren't all connected once. They weren't all side by side necessarily. Remember, Tykenia, Rangelia, and Quinellia, and all these, they all have their different geologic histories. So that means they all formed in somewhat different locations. But eventually, some might have even, yeah, they would have come from various parts, say from Mexico or California, and then worked their way up, but from different locations. But the most outboard ones, clearly the pattern shows are the ones that moved the most. I don't know if I was answered your question or not.
My question was, there's a piece of land that you showed which had the same color as Cornelia, I think.
Yeah.
I don't remember the name of the ammonite there. And those in the same chart, you have another piece of land somewhere in California,
Mm-hmm.
also have the same type of ammonite.
You mean the Tethian, the orange ones or
Yeah,
whatever?
it wasn't orange, it was like more brown.
Okay. I can,
So, I was kind of like curious.
Let's go back.
They were all connected together.
well, they weren't.
Yeah, the one yeah.
That one?
Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
See that in that, there is, they were all brown there, right?
Are you looking at the ones to
The one in Oregon,
oh, the one in Oregon?
and those pieces, and the one, above, I can't see it clearly, it's probably Quinnipiac.
That's Cornelia, right, yeah. By that time, I think in the Upper Jurassic, I think those were probably pretty close to being in place at the time. I know the one, I mentioned the one where the John Day area, we informally can call it the John Day terrain. Rebecca Dorsey did a really good job of tectonic interpretation, for the northeastern part of Oregon. I won't get into the details of it, but she showed how these terrains were kind of fixated a little bit, during the early to middle part of the Mesozoic. What we see in the Supli IZ area, for example, we see upper Triassic through lowermost Jurassic that have been squeezed tightly as the terrain was slamming against another terrain. It was accreting at that time. And some of the folding, I was thinking about showing a picture of it. I have rocks in the upper Triassic that are folded. We call it isoclinal folding, where it goes like that. And they're just absolutely squeezing together. This is up through the basal part of the Jurassic. And then finally, you find what's called the Supli and the Nicely formation on top of that. There's some structural complexity. They may be dipping 45 degrees or so, but the warping is much gentler. So the accretion of this terrain in the Supli IZ area, clearly, it was slammed into the continent in the early part of the Jurassic. It was pretty much all done moving after that period of time. A little bit of transport, a little bit of slipping that way, but fundamentally in place by that time.
Okay, and from west, do the fossils in the John Day and Wallowas just consist of reptile and marine fossils?
I mean, there are different animal groups. Yeah, reptiles and marine fossils for the most part.
For the
Yes.
most part?
Yeah, a wide variety of marine fossils, but yeah, mainly marine. Okay. Oh, yes.
Did the asymmetrical tail disappear with the marine reptiles, or did that carry on in other species? Or would it-
You know, well, you asked a question that I haven't even thought about, you know, so. No, I don't have any idea. I said that facetious. But I don't know of any asymmetrical tail like that. Yeah, after the extinction event.
Tailbone function as a kind of rudder.
Yeah, I think it did. Yeah. Yeah, it had like the downturned tail sequence in the ichthyosaurs, for example. I mean, it's added support clearly to that flipper at the end, and it would have clearly formed like a rudder. I think that's a good analogy. Yeah.
It was more direction control as opposed to propeller.
There was more what?
It was more of a direction control as opposed to propeller.
Yeah, yeah, it could have been. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Anybody else? Here? I think we're good.